Hi, we're Darren, Yeji, Gil, Hugh, and Victoria, and we're going to talk about the overview of Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which is the first statewide rent control imposed in California. So we're going to start off with introducing the act itself, and then we're going to move on to the conflicting opinions about the regulation.
So, what is in the Tenant Protection Act? It was enacted by Gavin Newsom, the California governor, on October 8th, 2019. There are basically two purposes of it, which are it limits landlords' ability to increase residential rents and to remove residential tenants without proper cause. And the local governments could take some pressures off to address rising rents through local enactments. There are two major impacts and provisions of the Act. First is to impose a percentage limit on annual rent increases. And the second is to introduce a just cause requirement for terminating tenants who have occupied a property for 12 months or more. For imposing a percentage limit on annual rent increases, the percentage is kept at 5% of the gross rental rate plus the change in cost of living, which must not exceed 10%. There are four major exemptions to be considered. Um, so, housing that has been issued a certificate of occupancy within the previous 15 years, housing restricted by a regulatory agreement or deed with a government agency, duplexes with at least one unit occupied by the owner, and the single-family homes, townhomes, or condos not owned by the corporations or LLC are exempted, basically.
So now I'd like to help you understand the intention behind the Tenant Protection Act by examining the whole housing situation of California. So to clarify the legislative body's intent, the bill's author declared upon writing the bill the unique circumstances of the current housing crisis in California that required a statewide response to address rent gouging by establishing statewide limitations on gross rental rate increases. So what is it that makes the housing market situation in California so unique, as the legislator put it? The unique housing in California comes from the incredibly high demand of rental apartments. So in California, it's home to one of the biggest residential real estate markets in the United States, with large metropolitan cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco. So in LA, apartments cost an average of more than $2,500 a month. And for instance, 65% of units are higher than the average price a decade ago. Uh, and also, landlords screen an average of 2 applicants per rental property. So the graph on the left represents the average rent rate growth of California. Los Angeles County apartment rents increased almost $500 a month, or 34% in just 7 years. In Orange County, rents increased $355 a month, while in the Inland Empire, they're up $266 a month. More than half of Southern California's tenants are rent burdened, which means that they spend at least a third of their income on rent. And households with lower incomes are especially likely to have rent costs that are unaffordable to them. So the graph on the right shows that more than 8 in 10 low-income households were rent cost burdened in 2015, and more than half of those households spent more than half of their income on housing. At the same time, only 15% of high-income households were housing cost burdened, as I put it, in 2015, with less than 3% of them being severely cost burdened.
Now we're going to talk about the benefits of rent control for both tenants and landlords. The biggest and the most obvious benefit for tenants is the financial savings year over year. Most of the tenants in California, especially in overpopulated cities such as Los Angeles and San Francisco, have been subjected to a hefty increase of rent rates at some point. So, since rent control limits the amount of legal increase, tenants are typically in favor of the regulations. Therefore, rent control can provide better financial stability for the tenants. Another benefit for tenants is the protection from the unjust evictions. This is aimed primarily at preventing landlords from evicting tenants who wish to resign their lease. With the Tenant Protection Act, there exists the just cause limitations, which we'll cover in the next slide. And for the benefits of the landlords, since rent are capped with legal regulations, tenants are much more inclined to stay in a property for long term. Tenants generally do not prefer risking a big increase in price for their next residential place. A study by Stanford University on the effects of rent control in San Francisco found that the rent control policies limited renters' mobility by 20% and decreased population displacement from the city. Another benefit for landlords is that it lowers the turnover rate of the tenants. So, lower turnover also let landlords have less concern with vacancy every year because the current tenants will likely renew their lease. Vacancy periods in less popular areas tend to cost landlords a lot of money. Therefore, some landlords can also be benefited by such regulations as they can eliminate the cost of vacancy. Also, keeping rental rates predictable makes it easier for tenants to budget successfully and pay on schedule. Without rent control, landlords could increase rent by a more substantial margin, but in doing so, they could also jeopardize their income by pricing good tenants out of a home. So now we're going to talk about the just cause limitations that we talked about on the previous slide. The Tenant Protection Act contains three main sections that protects tenants not only from the rent hikes, but also from the possibility that the landlords take advantage of the tenants. However, with protection, tenants may also take advantage of the landlords in the opposite way. So to prevent such issue, the legislature includes the Civil Code Section 1946.2, also known as the just cause limitations under AB 1482, which is another name for the Tenant Protection Act. So what this basically does is this prohibits the termination without just cause of tenant who has lived in the unit for at least 12 months. The legislation requires written notice of a just cause for termination of certain tenancies. The just cause is broken down into two categories. So first, at fault just cause includes, among other reasons, consistent non-payment of rent, criminal activities on the property, or criminal threats against the owner or the owner's agent. No fault just cause, on the other hand, includes intent to occupy the unit by certain family members of the owner, withdrawal of the property from the rental market, and then compliance with government order or local ordinance that necessitates vacating the property.
So next, I'm going to talk about economic disadvantages of rent control. First, rent control causes inefficient allocation of housing units, which means it does not allow units to be allocated to the residents who would benefit most. Tenants living in rent-controlled apartments are likely to stay in those units as long as they can, even if the unit is no longer appropriate for their household. And this reduced mobility can limit the availability of family-sized units, like units with 3 or more bedrooms, even after children have moved out on their own. Or it can cause housing overcrowding if they stay in homes that are too small as their family grows. Also, like the first graph shows, lots of people have stayed in LA County more than 20 years without moving out. It suggests that the tenants may be less likely to change jobs or may be more likely to endure long commutes because they don't want to move into new units with higher rent. So it can bring the result of reduction in the supply of affordable housing available to those with lower incomes and eventually increase the homelessness in the community. As we can see in the second image, the number of people experiencing homelessness in 2019 in California is more than 150,000. Compared to Virginia, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, where the rent control is not imposed, California shows relatively much higher number of homelessness. It means that low vacancy rate for rental housing can hurt extremely low income people because it forces them to compete with higher income renters for the same artificially limited pool of housing stock. Therefore, it seems like the policy will worsen the problem.
So to continue with our cons, we'll be taking a look at economic factors of rent levels on the marketplace, where the mindset of advocates for rent control falls in line with many progressive politicians, as the main objective is to attain affordable housing for all. In order to achieve this, regulations are put in place to keep rent below market rates. To further illustrate, a cap on rent causes landlords to sell their rental properties to owner occupants, which will permit the owners to earn the market price for their real estate. Because rental rates are below market rates, renters have the proclivity to consume excessively quantities of housing. Rent-controlled apartments can still be so expensive, as where a renter moves out, the landlord can raise the price to whatever they seem fit. Initially, apartments that can be offered at an affordable price in Los Angeles, California, will gradually increase significantly once a new tenant moves in. For example, a person renting in Redondo Beach, which does not have its own rent control law. However, Los Angeles County metropolitan area, their inflation rate is at 3.3%, which means that their landlord can raise the rent as much as 8.3%, which in sum is an increase of $129 per month. With that being said, capitalism is an enemy of rent control, as it prevents rent control's purpose of achieving high quality, affordable housing. A capitalist society perceives land and housing stock as commodities. All commodities that are under capitalism have a profit motive that rules the production and maintenance of housing, as capitalists don't stay in the business based on the quality and quantity of their commodity that they produce, but based on whether if they can make a profit or not.
Also, rent control will reduce the supply and housing availability in both the short and long term. The policy will induce owners of properties to convert their buildings to commercial buildings, though they may take rental units off the market in the short term. If they redevelop their properties such that the new units are not subject to the policy, the supply of affordable rental housing will decrease. Also, in the long term, while the regulation excludes new construction within 15 years, if rent control puts downward pressure on market rents, or if developers fear that new units will be subject to controls in the future, they may not build new housing and get out of the rental housing business.
So to end off, we'd like to imbue the ideals of how economic theories do not support most models of rent regulation. To summarize, if property owners are not able to turn a profit by raising rent, then they will be hesitant on developing new properties or maintaining current ones, thus putting a risk of deterioration. As a result of rental control, there is a continued reduce of profit margins over a long period of time, which gradually makes it necessary for investors to either abandon the property or significantly reduce its cost. If rent rates are beneath market rates, renters may migrate to other housing options and exhaust housing quantities. Rent control can cause a decay in rent stock. Consequently, property owners cannot recuperate and may not invest. As people invest in real estate because of long-term financial benefits, rent control restricts the money that investors could make, where rent-controlled apartments and houses have the propensity to fall below the market rates. Due to this, landlords do not have the incentives to upgrade houses because they become limited to yearly increase that the laws permits. As a result, landlords are more likely to choose the same appliances that they've gradually used, and they'll replace them in time with similar or lesser models. And thanks again. That's it.
Thank you for listening to our presentation on rent control.
Thank you.